In my last stint at Microsoft, I tended to talk to new graduates who are just joining the workforce and give them some advice about how money works and things they should and shouldn't do with all this money they were suddenly earning. Both myself and another principal engineer called this the money talk. It was really just an introduction so that people would have advice and context that we were missing when we were first starting out. The rest of this video is going to give some of the elements from the money talk. Now, before we go into it, I want to emphasize this is intended to give you some context so that you go and learn about these things on your own and follow up on them. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm just a guy who has had to deal with having some money. Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I've been working in big tech for about 30 years in a variety of different jobs. Over that time, I made pretty much every big mistake you could make with money and a lot of little ones too. Some of my decisions resulted in me losing out on millions of dollars. Other decisions resulted in me feeling trapped at a job when I really wasn't. Still others meant that I missed out on some cheap, easy steps to take early on that would really set you up well for retirement. The net effect of that is that I had to work harder later. Just listening a little bit right now can set you on a path where that doesn't happen to you. If you're a software engineer, especially in big tech, congratulations. You've found yourself in a life that can lead you to a very comfortable lifestyle and the opportunity to retire early if that's something that's important to you. But it's also a bit complicated. If you haven't had a fair amount of money before, for example, if this is your first job, then it's very confusing. There's a lot of different options that can be difficult to choose between without context. As a result, it's easy to make mistakes that can cost you money. Software engineers usually have one or more of three different types of compensation. First is salary, a fixed amount of money that you receive each year. The second is a bonus, which is a discretionary amount of money that you get for doing your job. For somebody who's early in their career, it'll typically range somewhere between 0% and 15% of their annual wages. The final type of compensation is called equity. That can be either stock awards or stock options, which are given to the employee and vest over a series of years. The value of that stock for somebody who is relatively new to the workforce will typically be the order of your bonus. Now, typically when you're working for a big company, they automatically withhold taxes from your compensation. Now, this is actually a good thing. It keeps you from getting in trouble when tax season rolls around and being unable to pay whatever you owe. So I strongly recommend that you stick with federal tax withholding and any other withholding there is that's by default. You might be able to do something interesting with the money until you have to pay it for taxes, but you can also wind up losing it and being in trouble. In addition to the traditional compensation, you might also have access to something called a 401k program. This is a pre-tax savings program that lets you tuck money away that you can access in your retirement. It may seem like a bad idea to have money put someplace where it's difficult for you to touch it for years and years, but they make up for this by making it pre-tax dollars. And typically a company will match a certain amount of those pre-tax dollars. For example, 50% up to 3% of your salary. The general advice I have for this is to try and put the amount into your 401k that is matched by your employer. If they do 50% matching, this means that typically you'll be putting away twice as much as you would for putting the same amount of money into your own savings. For example, let's say you were going to put $4,500 into this program. If you're making $100,000 a year, that $4,500 is actually $6,000 pre-tax with the same amount out of your net income, and then the 50% matching brings it up to $9,000, which is twice the amount of savings as you could do on your own with the same amount of impact to your net income. Another common benefit at the big public tech companies is something called an employee stock purchase program. This is a chance for you to have a payroll deduction over a window of time, say 6 months or a year, that gets put into buying stock at a discount. Normally that discount will be something like 10%. You're sort of getting free money with that extra 10%. Even better, many stock purchase programs will take the stock price at the beginning of the period of payment withholding and the end of that period and let you use whichever of those is lower as the base price to then subtract 10% from. For example, let's say that over the withholding period you saved up $5,000. At the start of the period the stock was worth $100 a share. At the end of the period the stock was worth $120 a share. And let's say you have a 10% discount. This means that your purchase price for that stock would be $90 a share. and your $5,000 would give you 55.5 shares. Now at the current share price of 120, that would be over $6,000. For your $5,000 of investment, you wind up making more than $1,000 over the withholding period. As long as you sell in a timely fashion, it's actually a pretty good deal. I was awful at selling. I tried to do it at a time where the stock was flat or dropping, and ultimately I wound up not having access to the money that was being withheld and losing money by the time I went around to selling the stock. So this made me personally not invest in the stock purchase programs. But if you're good about following up on these things, it's absolutely a good idea to take advantage of it. That covers the basic types of compensation. But how much do you actually get in your pocket? How much net do you get out of all that money that you're earning? And what should you do with it once you get it? Getting a good job, especially if you haven't had one before, can lead you to feeling like you have an infinite amount of money. You might take a look at that $100,000, $110,000 a year that you're making and think there's no possible way that you could spend it, but you go and try. This can be a problem because you're not actually getting that $110,000 in your pocket. Instead, what happens is part of that is a bonus that you only get once a year, so you sort of ignore that. Let's say you have $100,000. That gets broken up into paychecks, but there's tax that you owe on those paychecks. Out of $100,000 that goes into regular paychecks, you might wind up losing 30% of that to taxes, Social Security, and a few other taxes, and that's if you're in a place that doesn't have state taxes. The net effect of this is you might wind up with 70% of that $100,000 or $70,000 a year that you can actually touch and spend. So now you realize you have $70,000 instead of $100,000 a year. You can compensate for that. Well, it's still a good idea to put some money into cash savings. Typically the recommendation is to have 3 to 6 months of easily accessible money that you can use in case there's a problem at work or an emergency, or you just decide that you're not interested in the job anymore. This should be a chunk of money you only touch in emergencies, and as I said, it should be easily accessible. So 3 to 6 months of net income. You may be tempted to save more than that amount of money in cash, but I recommend that you consider other options. One of the challenges of saving money and putting it in, for example, a bank account, is that inflation tends to eat at the value of that money. In other words, if you put $1,000 in the bank and then you take that $1,000 out in 5 years and spend it, you're going to wind up being able to buy maybe $900 or $800 of merchandise in today's money. Before you rush out and spend that $70,000 a year, think carefully about your fixed expenses. You need to understand how much you're on the hook for every month. For example, if you got $1,500 in rent and a $500 car payment and $250 a month in gas and parking and things like that, food, and so on, you can wind up with just $1,000 or $2,000 a month that's discretionary. It can still be a lot of money, but you need to understand how much you have. So I recommend paying special attention to what you spend for the first 3, 6, 12 months, summing it all up and dividing it by the number of months in that period. And that will help you understand how much you're on the hook for. You can take out the things that are big discretionary spends if you want to divide up between things you have to pay like utilities and the discretionary things you got for fun. But you should do this and then subtract it from your net salary for the same period to understand how much you have to play with. One common trap that people fall into when they start earning some money is that they think, well, I'm going to have this job forever and it's going to be steady income. Why should I wait to buy the bigger things that I really want? Why don't I just get a couple credit cards and buy them and enjoy them while I'm paying them off? Now, in theory, this sounds like a good idea, but the reality is you're spending money that you don't have. So you can think of it as, let's say that your monthly net income was $2,000 a month, and then you take your credit card and you turn that into $4,000 a month. Sooner or later, your credit is going to come due, and then you won't have that extra $2,000 a month, so you wind up, instead of that $4,000, only being able to spend $2,000. But even worse, you have to pay your credit card bills now, and you owe everything you spent and then some. So suddenly, that $2,000 extra a month that you were getting for a year, you're going to be paying something like $2,000 a month for a year and a half to pay it off. So you go from having $4,000 a month that you've been spending and living the high life to your original $2,000 minus the $2,000 you owe, or $0 a month of discretionary income for 18 months. Absolutely not worth it. So be very careful about spending money you don't have. Also, realize that there's people who make their money off of lending money to other people and getting interest out of it. This means that they will tend to look at somebody who's got a good job and whose wages they could garnish as somebody who's a very good money-making opportunity for them. They will be more than willing to loan you way more money than you should borrow for cars, or house, or whatever. You need to be sensible about the amount that you borrow. Don't assume that, oh, well, since they're willing to loan it to me, it must be safe for me to take. Absolutely not the case, especially if you have a good job. Another thing that often happens for the first time with people who get a job in big tech and get access to stock awards and stock options is suddenly they have a brokerage account and they're talking to other people who play in the stocks and they think, oh, it's just free money. Now that I have money, all I have to do is go and play and I can time the market or I can pick the right stocks to make lots of money. This is generally not the case. In fact, the rule of thumb is it's very difficult for any individual investor to be able to match the general growth of the market, never mind beating it. This applies not just to amateur investors like us, but to professional investors, financial advisors, financial consultants, and so on. So I would also recommend against getting embroiled with anybody who says they're going to actively manage stocks on your behalf. A much safer route for you to invest money that you want to invest is to use some sort of a mutual fund or an index fund. I'm especially fond of index funds. A mutual fund is a set of stocks that are actively sort of managed by a company, and they take care of changing the mix of those stocks and adding new ones that look promising, getting rid of dogs, and you as an investor in that fund just put a certain amount in and somebody else is taking care of all the hard work. Generally speaking, you get to choose what type of fund that you want, whether you want it to be very conservative and unlikely to lose money but not very likely to make a lot of money, or whether you want it to be an aggressive fund that has larger swings in it. Do your homework, but a mutual fund is not a bad place to put money. An even better place to put it, in my opinion, is something called an index fund. An index fund is a special sort of mutual fund that rather than having a constantly changing mix of stocks and bonds, it will take a look at what defines the index for something like the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, and it will have the same mix of stocks in the same ratios as those indexes. If there's a period where the NASDAQ index goes up by 5%, for example, then your investment in a NASDAQ index fund will also go up by 5% or drop by 10% if it happens to drop. It can be a way of matching the market performance, which, as we said earlier, is actually quite a difficult thing to do as an investor. One caveat when we talk about investing in these things, all these should be considered long-term investment. In other words, something you hold on to for years rather than for months. In the short term, and even sometimes in the medium term, you can have a lot of oscillations in the market. The market can drop substantially and require a year or two to recover. You don't want to be in a position where you just bought high and you're having to sell low. So as you invest money, don't invest money unless you can afford to let it sit there and work for at least a few years. Earlier I mentioned how money that you have sitting in a savings account or under your mattress at home winds up losing its value over time due to inflation. Inflation, if you're not already familiar with it, is a way of quantifying the amount of buying power that a fixed amount of money loses over time. Inflation is something you'll find in pretty much any economy. Sometimes it's hyperinflation like Zimbabwe, which saw inflation in the millions of percent. Other times it's inflation like we have in the US, anywhere from say 0 or 1% a year up to maybe 20% a year in the worst of the 70s. Inflation is calculated by taking a look at a set of consumer commodities that people need, food, gas, things like this, and see what the price changes over time. That lets you calculate how much more expensive in sort of absolute dollars it is to buy a certain amount of those things after a year than it was a year ago. So if it would have cost $1,000 right now, and then in a year it would cost $1,050, you would say, well, that's 0.5% inflation. In order to make money in your investments, you want to have something that has an average return that's higher than inflation. So if you put it in the bank, that generally won't be true, which means your money buys a little less every year that you leave it there. However, if you take a look at the markets over a long period of time, say the last 50 years, the S&P 500 went up by an average of 10.5% a year. That's an average. Some years it dropped a lot, some years it went up a lot. But on average over that time period, it went up by 10.5%. Over that same interval, inflation in the US was about 4% a year. So what you can do is you can take that 10.5% total growth, subtract out the 4% inflation, and then you wind up with an effective increase in the buying power of your money. So 10.5 minus 4 is roughly 6.5%. That means that after a year, you'd be able to buy 6.5% more stuff with your money because you'd have enough money increase not only to make up for inflation, but some on top of that. The last thing I want to mention is financial planners, financial consultants, all these types of people. They can be independent, they can be associated with a particular brokerage and tell you that they're there to help you plan how to use your money. Make no mistake, these are professionals. They know a lot about the markets, but they also make their money based off of getting you as a client and doing things with your money. And it's not necessarily proportional to the benefit that you see. Be very careful about engaging a financial planner or financial consultant. Make sure you understand the fee structure. If it's something that's based around them making trades on your behalf and they get a certain percentage of that, which typically they will for however they're trading, you want to be very cautious because that incentivizes them to trade your money. Remember, even these people typically can't meet the performance of the market, let alone exceed it. So your motivation to use them rather than an index fund or something like that, you should think carefully about that. Summing things up, we talked a bit about the 3 types of compensation you'll typically get as a software engineer, which is salary, annual bonus, and stock awards or stock options. We talked about 401k, which is a way to multiply the amount of money that you're putting away to use when you're retired. We also talked about employee stock purchase programs, which some companies will offer, and some of the benefits of those. I also gave general advice about the market. In a nutshell, it's be careful how much you spend, save what you need, and then for money that you want to save beyond what you need, you should think about putting in the market, but be conservative. Think about mutual funds and index funds. Don't think so much about special vehicles like options. Thank you very much for your patience in making it this far in the video, and keep on pushing forward. Hi, this is John. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing so you get notified of my future videos. Also, if you are interested, you might want to check out the video I have linked here. Thanks, and keep on pushing forward.